Well, welcome everybody to the very first episode of Winging It, a community cloudcast presentation presented by myself, Eric Shupps, and my fellow co-host, Mr. Robert Bogue. Rob, how are you?
Hello. Gotta get the hands in there so they know this background's not virtual.
Are jazz hands part of the
jazz hands?
Is that thing? We want to thank everybody for joining us. So as mentioned in the Community Cloudcast monthly presentation, we'll be bringing you some additional content via our Winging It series. This will be Rob and I talking about typically Office 365, Microsoft cloud related stuff, but we can venture into any topic as we see fit. Never quite know where we'll end up. We will try to stay on task, but sometimes that can be hard for us.
Meow. Poor cats.
So quickly, I'd like to, of course, thank our sponsors. If I can get the like share the screen. There we are. All right, there we go. Got that working. So I want to thank our sponsor, Aptigent. Just released a massive new update to Sales Power Tools for Salesforce. So that's available now in the App Exchange. About 30 odd new actions available in Salesforce and a new try-by experience for it as well. Much streamlined on the website. So be sure to go and check that out at www.aptigent.com. Right. So jumping into our content, this month we'll be talking about something that is near and dear to both Rob and I, which is enterprise content management, something we've both been dealing with for, I guess, most of our careers. I guess I really didn't start doing ECM in probably 2010-ish, but Rob, I think you've been doing this kind of stuff longer than that.
Yeah, I mean, so actually though, if you think about it, so 2010 was about the time frame that we started doing that we did the ECM implementers course for Microsoft. It was about that time frame. So you've been doing it for a long time. I actually started with FileNet, which now IBM has, but before that, they were their own company. Also did some IBM Content Manager and, a lot of smaller players where we were trying, when back in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, like document management, enterprise content management, that stuff was all hard. So there you go. Love it.
Look, I like the pictures at the bottom just to show how stinking young we were.
Right. Right.
Even Spence looks young in that photo.
Yeah, I think we had just invented fire when we
it was just after that.
Yeah, oh yeah, there was dirt, fire, then ECM.
Then ECM, yeah. But the reason I have this in one of my slide presentations, actually, where I talk about ECM and Office 365, is to demonstrate how little the core concepts have actually changed from when we built this content. So for those who aren't familiar with, haven't been around a long time, back in the 2010 wave for SharePoint, Rod led a project to do an enterprise content management implementation course, but it was beyond that. It was a deep dive. It was almost like P&P for ECM.
Yeah.
And I wrote a couple chapters for it, and you'll recognize some of the faces on here who contributed to it, of course, and Ben, Rob, and Spence, and Darren, and the gang. And there was a lot of work and effort put into this. It was I don't know how many slides we ended up with, hundreds of slides, all kinds of demos. It was a big deal work.
Yeah. Well, and it was a funny thing because SharePoint had grown up without this ECM focus. It did enterprise content management, or they would call it departmental content management. And that's probably, in hindsight, fair. But nobody knew they did it, right? Everybody still, back then, everybody renamed their files every time they saved. They do save as V1, V2, V3, final, I used to be final, now I'm not anymore. Like, it was just this crazy naming, and all that stuff was built into the system if you just knew how to use it. So
yeah, and I guess the biggest thing we got out of that was actually the cool zunes we got that were engraved with the ECM.
Yeah, I did a lot of work. So Zune, for those of you who don't know, was a thing that was supposed to play music that Microsoft created around the time of the iPod that nobody figured out that they existed or what the heck a Zune was. But they were beautiful. The first memory ones, because the other ones were hard drives. Imagine like carrying around a brick. Now,
Right. I
you'll-
remember. I still have the original too. But the
right.
first iPods weren't any different, right? It was a big clunky.
Yeah, right. No, they weren't. But yeah. So we one of the gifts at the end was the uh 64 gig Zunes. That was the entire extent. Um, so now you've got more than that on your phone, I'm sure. So
Yeah. Yeah, no doubt. But the core concept is last time I went and updated my slide deck for ECM, I went back through and I thought how much of this has really changed. And the truth is, the core concepts of ECM really haven't changed. And I would probably argue because we haven't mastered them yet.
yeah, I think so. So all the core stuff that everybody wants, right? Like so you want to have fields on your files, and you want to have version control and check in, check out, which we've mostly gone away from. Thank you. All that stuff's been in there forever. And I think the content types, the idea that you can put different kinds of content in the same space, and it has different fields that are required, and so you can put content around a project together. All that stuff's been in there. In fact, I've got a slide somewhere. I'll have to get it to you of the features that existed in 2007, 2010, 2013. And then I think I stopped because they stopped adding new
Right.
things, right? Like they're like, oh, nope, we ran out. There's nothing else to do. Um, and
Well,
and so that's been
fixing the things would have been a good thing to do.
no breaking. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're but yeah, like so all of the stuff that we're talking about for ECM is been there for a long time. And in fact, we're talking about this as ECM, where the market has more or less moved on to this idea of content services, which is not really that fundamentally different. It's just they had to relabel it because, well, it was Gartner that started it, and they had to do something to stay relevant. So,
Mm.
one of the things that I think is really interesting if we pull down this uh, content services tangent is really we forget that ECM, enterprise content management, should be background. Nobody should have to think about, did I save my Word document? We now have autosave built into Office when you're connected to the right repositories. Nobody should have to think about those sorts of things. And that's what content services is supposed to do, which was really, I think, a move from the repository, in this case SharePoint, was important to, it doesn't matter where your file is. Like, people want to get their stuff and work with their stuff, and they don't care if it's in SAP HANA or if it's in wherever it is. They just want it to work. And I think we've moved a little bit further in that direction. So back in the 2010 timeframe, as we were starting, enterprise file sync and store didn't exist. The OneDrive or the Dropbox or the whatever, it just didn't exist. Where now we can pretend like the files are local, behave like they're local, and on the back end they're out in the cloud somewhere, but that doesn't actually really matter all that much. What do you think? So the biggest advance since 2010, what do you think was the thing that they added and you're like, ooh, I wanted that?
I would the thing that it has excited me most, and it's one of the few things that they've actually done in this space and released, is the whole concept of at a tenant level sensitivity labels and policy application at a
Yeah.
tenant level.
Yep.
Like being able to define rules that apply sensitivity labels that follow the asset wherever it goes, right, within the cloud repository, I think is a big advancement. Did we have labeling before? Yes. And it was this really clunky thing where you had to plug in Azure RM and all these weird things that you had to do, which, okay, to be fair, you still have to do that a little bit for certain
Right.
things. But from a labeling perspective, being able to attach things like barcoding that can follow an asset, right, wherever it goes, right?
Right.
Very important for records management. Very clunky the way it was done in the past, if you could do it at
Yeah.
all. And now that's seamless in the background in the cloud if someone who knows what they're doing has configured it properly. And I think that I don't know how much of an impact that has made, but as an ECM practitioner, from my perspective, and when I show it to people, that's the thing where they go, "Ooh, we could use that."
Yeah. And I think what you're highlighting there is this there used to be this chasm, and on the one side of the chasm was email, which is an unstructured document, right? Like we don't think about it as content or documents, but it is. It has all the same characteristics, a little bit of metadata, a whole bunch of other stuff, right? And then we had SharePoint or, whatever file management. And what labeling did was it brought those together. And it doesn't matter. Is it an email? Is it a document? Is it, a table napkin that you scanned in? It doesn't matter. It's all gets the same set of rules. And so the same life cycle can apply to it. One of the other things that I loved about SharePoint actually from the very beginning was that the if you used content types, and like 2% of the population did, but if you used content types, you could define the rules for the content. This has this template. This has this retention schedule. It behaves this way. Like all of that stuff you could tie to the content type. And so then all of a sudden you could say, well, a purchase request behaves this way, which was super cool because then when you went to implement business systems, you could say, I need a purchase request. Okay. So,
And you could, taking that a step further, you could define a centralized repository of those that was accessible
yes,
by everybody in the organization, right?
absolutely.
Managed and controlled in one place, and even assign workflow to it so that
Right.
a purchase request always followed the same approval process.
Yeah, that had some that had some life cycle issues, had a couple of issues
Indeed.
there. But fundamentally, yes, you could define this is what this thing is and does, and this is how it'll behave, which was amazing. And in fact, if you look at the traditional ECM players, even in the last 10 years ago, they they had similar things where we have a content type, they typically will call it a doc type or a doc profile or something like that. Um, but I think this space highlights another key difference between where we are today and where SharePoint is versus where the classic ECM tools were. When ECM first started out, it was against a process. Hey, this is accounts payable, or this is accounts receivable, or this is invoice tracking or contract tracking or whatever. And you had to have 100,000 instances of whatever it was, or you didn't look at ECM because it was just too darn expensive and difficult. And that's great in the kind of purchase request and invoice and that kind of stuff. But the way that we use content management now is a lot more fluid, right? Hey, I'm working on this document. Eventually it'll become a record, and I need to figure out how I'm going to tell somebody it's a record, and then it'll have to be protected. But for right now, I'm pounding it out on my laptop while I'm in an American Airlines club waiting on a flight. And I think that's actually one of the powerful things that SharePoint brought as an ECM tool is it could do the big stuff. It could do the you know hundreds of thousands of things that were the same, or you could also be just banging something out and then categorize it later and kind of plug it into the system, which is super
Well,
cool.
and of course, there were a lot of things that were kind of partway done there, and as great as content types were fundamentally broken
Yeah.
behind the scenes, and so many of those things haven't translated into the cloud for obvious reasons because it didn't
Yeah.
scale. But now it seems like, talking about the current state of things, it seems like we carried forward some classic features. There was a little bit of innovation, and then we just hit a wall. Boom, and it stopped. And so we now have this, at least in the Microsoft cloud space, this mix of legacy stuff that still kind of does pretty much what it did out of the box before. We have some
Yep.
new stuff, right? DLP and whatnot. And then, of course, we had the redheaded stepchild just burst into the room and throw their toys everywhere in the name of Teams and just mess it all up, right? And
Right.
now nobody quite knows. Okay, now how are we supposed to deal with this beast? Because nothing you do in Teams can be managed, right, as a structured type.
Right. Well, it's it's incredibly difficult. It's not impossible to do it with Teams, but it takes a lot of work. And most people just aren't willing to do the work. And I think this actually gets into the collaboration versus business process, right? If it's a structured process, you need that repeatability. You need to be able to automate it. And a lot of what Teams was originally built around was this idea of collaboration. And we're just going to throw everything into a big pile and hope people can sort of find it inside their own space, which is okay, right? Like it's okay. Um, I don't know about you, but I often now create teams as I would have created SharePoint sites in the past. I create teams because I know it creates a site. I will occasionally use one of the cool new features, planner, whatever. Um, but there are times when we develop teams which are very little more than file repositories, um, because the communication that happens either can't happen all inside, or like it's split and you get some people external, but they're not. You don't really want them a member of the team because you really don't want them to have everything. Right? Like it just. I think a lot of people have defaulted to that. It's a file repository with extras.
Which would be okay if it actually implemented the ECM features, which it doesn't.
Right, right,
All right.
right.
So
Well,
there's
yeah,
actually no problem with simplifying that experience. The site
right.
model became very heavyweight, right? And a lot of too much stuff added to it and whatnot. And so Teams comes along to, in certain ways, streamline that. But then you lose all of those management capabilities on top of it. That if you were managing structured content in a structured way, just blew everything up.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, if I had to register a complaint about the things that have happened that have made things worse, not better, I think my top complaint is actually the ability to create templates in a document library which are not associated with a content type, right? Like, yeah, there's a fundamental system for managing this is what something is, and it supports templates and it does all this stuff, and we've done this for a decade. And then they went and implemented this thing where you upload a document and it becomes a template. And I'm like, well, that's great. I appreciate that you've done that, but you could have built a content type to it so that we could get back to that manageability that you're talking
Mhm.
about.
Yeah, indeed. And I think what happens is, it's the whole "you're holding it wrong" argument, where people go into Teams, they start creating file repositories. What's the first thing they do in Teams? They start creating folders, right,
Yeah.
to put stuff in, because so much of that experience that we had in SharePoint is gone from inside of Teams. So they start whipping together folders, and in one fell swoop, we lost 15 years of of messaging to users and trying to drive home a change in behavior, and then they just blew it all.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we lost the battle, right? Like, so ECM in general lost the battle. We said you should be using metadata. And I've had some really interesting conversations with Reuven, um, Reuven Gotts, who some people will know, and always use metadata unless you can't. I'm like, well, okay, wait a minute. And we had problems with security with metadata because that never was implemented in SharePoint. And there were lots of other things, but we lost the battle when we started synchronizing enterprise file sync. We lost the battle. They're going to create folders. They're going to drag and drop. The metadata is gone. And I think you and I know that even all the way back in the ECM implementers course, we taught people how to bridge that gap, how you can use default metadata settings to push metadata when you go create folders. But not
Mhm.
very many people do it because it's just not a popular feature. Nobody thinks about it. It's not easy.
So
One of the other
how do we get back towards, or as you say, we've lost the battle, it's over, we're not going to do that. We've tried for, before SharePoint came along, 20, make it so the system sort of figured out metadata on its own. So far it hasn't worked,
right,
or at least it hasn't worked well. We'll have a
right.
different discussion on search and all the issues surrounding that. But no good metadata, no good search results. Customers are always complaining we can't find stuff.
Yep,
Okay, but you don't
right.
want to use metadata, and now we've given them tools that hide the metadata. How do we fix it?
Yeah, well, for clients that we work with, um, in spaces, right? Like we can't do this everywhere, but in spaces, we know what the folder hierarchy is, and we will actually go download from whatever system as a source of record all the customer numbers or all the customer names or whatever. And then we will go apply that metadata as default metadata settings. And we start doing we do the work behind the scenes that plumbs that stuff all together so that the users don't have to think about it. That requires that you have a very strict hierarchy, and level 1 is customer, level 2 is project, or whatever it is. And we do that a fair amount because that helps. But I think people would rather complain about search than do the work to get search to be good, right? And we should make that episode too. Is what about search? The other thing that's changed over the years is workflow. Microsoft has been through like 5 iterations of workflow, and this starts with BizTalk. For those of you unfamiliar, BizTalk was an application that Microsoft once did that was supposed to cause systems to talk to each other, but nobody could figure it out. And just like all the other enterprise network architecture bus translator things, they've mostly gone away because they were a nice fad for a while. But BizTalk had human workflow services in it, right? And then we had the 2007/2010 engine, workflow, it's WWF, Windows Workflow Foundation.
Windows Workflow Foundation, yeah.
Yeah, it's also a wrestling.
Yeah. Or was. Now it's the World Wildlife Federation. Right?
Yeah, right.
The wrestling had to change their name to WWE because they got in trouble. Yeah.
So you were either saving the whales, doing workflow, or getting thrown out of a ring. It was one of those. Anyway, so we had that, and then we had the 2013 model, right? And now we have what was Flow is now Power Automate.
Wait! You missed Workflow Manager in between.
Oh yeah,
which was a separate engine altogether.
Right. Yeah. So, the thing is, like, people talk to me about this, and they're like, "Well, what about workflow?" And I'm like, I have lots of reasons to hate what is now Power Automate. I have lots of reasons to hate it. And I have to say, they've got a lot of experience at screwing up workflow platforms. So they've not made some of the bigger errors, right? I think there's some great stuff about that, about Power Automate. I think there's some stuff that just drives me absolutely batty at times. But that having a powerful workflow engine behind your content repository is super important, right? And I think, and obviously that with the Aptigent stuff and kind of making that more realistically easy for users that have human brains to use versus the cyborgs that apparently are required to do it if you don't. But I don't know. I mean, I think we're in this spot where all the core is cool and we keep kind of jetting off into different places. And I don't know which of those places are going to survive in the long term. We talked about file sync. There's how many different file sync engines have we gone through?
Oh, yeah. Good grief. Too many.
Right. Groove, SkyDrive, and then OneDrive, and then OneDrive for Business, and then OneDrive Next Generation, which we do both personal and business.
And let's not forget, in between is the Office Sync engine that's gone through several iterations. It does things for you in the background. It's really good at screwing up your files in the background where you're not looking. And there's probably a few more we missed in between.
Oh, Live Mesh. I forgot about that.
Live Mesh. That's the one I was thinking of, which was basically Groove, but it was another iteration of it,
right?
And that's another area that we never seem to have resolved, because functional ECM requires metadata. Metadata requires some level of human intervention or AI. File sync just copies a blob object from one place to another, and there's no intelligence behind it, right? Other than things like, file properties. So it throws another monkey wrench into ECM because, unless you have some way to auto-classify stuff, how are you going to deal with that data?
Yeah, I mean, but let me hold for a second on the metadata problem, because file systems don't understand metadata. They don't understand properties, right? And that was the project that was killed, where WinFS was supposed to bring metadata into the file system on Windows, and the project was ultimately killed because they couldn't figure out how to make it work, which I'll be honest, I don't quite understand that, because they sort of know how to do that. I don't know what the issue was, but yeah, so you don't have properties, and so now you're just pushing these objects around. And another thing that most people don't know about is property promotion built into SharePoint. You can take a Word document, and if you put it in a library that has properties on it, or you set properties on it, those get pushed actually into the Word document, or can. And so we've used that a lot for document composition, right? So you can build a document that's the template, and you inject the metadata on the file after it's there. Then you can open it up in Word, and it looks like it's fully formed, because you have quick parts and document property fields, and it just is beautiful. It's another one of those hidden features that nobody knows how to use. And the way that what brought that to mind was those properties actually get copied into the XML, and carried around. So even if you take it out of the library, most people don't know that all of your newer Office file formats are actually zip files. Rename them .zip, they'll open in a zip editor, and inside of that are a collection of XML documents plus some assets, so images. But all of this stuff is sort of built around this idea that you don't have metadata locally, and you're working around it. Just challenging.
Well, and in the realm of things that just don't make sense, why isn't the document information panel surfaced automatically in the online editors, right? First of all, it was hard to turn on in the client. You had to know how to go and turn it on, and all the pain there. But why isn't it there?
Well, so DIP, the official DIP, so the official document information panel, right? And I'll get to a second, because the other stuff, because you're right, they've made it more difficult, not easier. But DIP actually was implemented in InfoPath, right? So document information panel, as it existed in the 2010 timeframe or 2013 timeframe, went away because they blew up InfoPath. But so I use for my blog posts, so I'm doing a blog post at least one a week, I use for that a SharePoint library that has fields, and all this stuff is controlled, and there's workflows, right? And I do this. If I want to go change my status to tell my editor it's ready, first of all, I can't do that until I have closed the document, waited 10 seconds, and reopened it, because the property literally doesn't exist until it's been saved and closed. And then I have to go into info, and then I have to go to the right-hand side, and I have to click more properties, and then I can get to the property if it exists. It doesn't need to be that hard. Like, why is there not a place that's easy for you to look at all the properties for the document and set it? Or, as we used to have, as you're talking about the document information panel, something that was just this horizontal bar at the top where you go, boom, it's ready, right? Go.
Yeah, easy.
Yeah.
And now that everything is these fly out panels from the right, I'm sure in the next version the fly out panels will be from the left, because that's how
Yeah, right. Like, so for those of you who haven't had 20 years of history with the product, the site actions menu consistently, it's right, it's left, it's right, it's left. It's like, what version am I on? Oh, it's on the right side. That makes it either 2007 or 2013, right? Like,
one was odd release numbers, one was even release numbers, and that's just how it worked.
Right. Well, and what about the user interface of the gear? So I can totally, I don't know if you can remember this, but the conversations when they first showed MVPs and others the gear, and it's impossible to describe the gear to a non-techie person. You're like, go hit the gear in the upper right hand corner. No, not the top gear, the gear that's below the top gear. Right?
Yeah.
But
Or the
that was back
cog,
in the
as our
time when
friends
we had to
across
talk
the
about the
pond like
feature
to call
feature.
it. Yeah, but we have that and always have had that kind of mechanism. We had the ribbon in the bar at the
Yeah.
top. Why are we obfuscating metadata properties? It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Right. Right. It should be super easy. Yeah.
And it's always been
There-
super hard.
Yeah. And as we talk about this bridge between how are we making it easy for the enterprise to do business operations with SharePoint versus doing ad hoc collaboration, one of the other challenges is um, it's difficult to manage metadata, particularly do it quickly in SharePoint. We don't have tools that are like, one of my clients is using Kofax, right? And we use it to ingest to SharePoint. But the reason they have to use it is because there's no good, fast metadata entry panel that you can put on top of SharePoint. And I'm sure the folks from totally blanking out Knowledge Lake would argue that they have a tool, and they do. Um, but why are we making this metadata hard? I get that we can't require it, but can we at least like make it easy? So
Yeah, and it's not, and it never has been.
right,
Which doesn't make a lot of sense, really. Knowing that we need to drive people towards this concept of managed metadata, or metadata. The managed metadata is a totally different topic, but just
manage
metadata.
metadata.
um, but we content types and metadata are so intrinsically important to any type of records management. You want to have a records library, then you need to have content types because everything is driven by the content.
Yep.
Content organizer to your policies, right, and whatnot. Now we can set policies. So we've muddied the waters a bit by saying, okay, we have retention policies, but they're not tied to a content type,
Right.
right? They're just a policy. Well, based on what? Well, some rules that you configure. Okay, or this is my favorite, a retention policy based on a regex match.
Yeah. Right.
Okay.
Of any property. Yeah.
How about no?
Yeah.
How about just no?
Yeah. Yeah. If you put record in the name, then we make it a record.
Yeah,
No.
yeah.
Bad idea.
So on the one
Yeah.
hand, we have this what I talked about as the good concept, and I still agree it is a good concept of having this tenant-wide ability to apply policy and labels and all that sort of stuff. That's great. But it's not matched to the fundamental components that we
Right.
need to actually implement that.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And which of course aren't implemented across tool sets.
Yeah, and they so I think they went to flexibility, and this is perhaps one of SharePoint's limitations is you can only do it 17 ways. You have to pick which one is best, right? And they went to more of that flexibility, and in some ways they didn't give people enough structure to do the right things at the right time, which has got its own challenges.
So
But you mentioned go ahead.
if I'm being tasked with this now in an organization, right? Saying, okay, we have all this records document that has to be treated as records management. Our file repository is Office Online or SharePoint Online. How do I approach this beast? Because it's pretty gnarly.
Yeah, I mean, so we still have the course that we've updated since all the way back from 2010. We still have that, and we will still sell that to clients. But the training for this space has gotten buried into other things, or has been lost along the way. I think you need to understand the fundamentals of information, the fundamentals of information architecture. There's all this fundamental stuff. And once you get the fundamentals, you start to see, okay, there's 5 ways to do it in SharePoint. 3 of them suck. 2 of them are okay. And one of them's going to win if you have a rock'em sock'em robot fight. So it's I think people have got to get training. And the problem is that people just think that, well, it's easy and I can just do it. And I think you and I've both been in those situations where you come into it and you're like, okay, well, you've done things wrong for 5 years, and your cleanup cost is $500,000 because there's no path out of this except to make it right.
Hmm.
Yeah. But you brought up MMS. I think we should talk about managed metadata service, or actually, I think you should.
Okay. Just throwing me into the well at first.
Yeah. Tag, you're it.
Yeah, well, a another good attempt, and to be fair, a reasonably successful attempt, when approached at the farm-wide level to say we're gonna implement, um, a structured taxonomy approach that's usable by everyone, and I always use when I'm talking about this, I always use the analogy of the big blue widget. So, somewhere in your organization, you have this thing on a factory floor, and it's this big blue machine. And so everybody calls it Big Blue, but its actual name is an XJ3257412. But you need to, at some point, be able to combine the folksonomy of Big Blue with the structured taxonomy of whatever its model number is. And when you do a search, you need to be able to get both of those things together because you may be an auditor that's searching for where are your maintenance records on this XJ whatever thing. Oh yeah, so I can just search for Big Blue maintenance records and get everything back, right?
Yep.
And so that's the panacea. And to implement that, we can use the synonym capability of managed metadata, where we can go in and say, what is this thing? Oh, it's Big Blue. Well, the system then knows it's also an XJ45, whatever it is. So that's a very smooth and efficient way to solve the problem.
Yep.
The implementation, of course, is where it's lacking in that managed metadata fields are clunky. They don't behave like other fields. They don't like workflow doesn't understand them or be able to parse them. You get them in code and they come with all these weird stuff that you have to parse out and try
Pound,
and figure.
semicolon. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Number, pound, semicolon, good, pound.
yeah, just okay. And then how do you, get the synonyms? And there's all these back and forth stuff. And I think that's why
Yep.
they eventually abandoned the REST service for it because it was just too much of a hassle. And all problems that could conceivably be worked around until we went to site level managed metadata, and then the whole thing went
Yeah, it
completely
just blew up. Yeah.
because you ended up with these little siloed. You can't migrate them. You can't transfer them. If you have like a prod and a DR farm, you can't keep them in sync, and it's just an absolute disaster.
Yep.
And to a point that some people saw. I'll give a shout out to the folks at Premier Point for having a term set tool that helps you synchronize with external data sources. The first thing that people say, "Oh, we have managed metadata." Okay, well, we have an enterprise lexicon that we need to tie
Right.
that to, and it's stored in a SQL database or this or what have you. How do we get the two together? Yeah, you don't.
Right. Right.
And then we went and put navigation on managed
Right. Yeah.
metadata and made it really crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so the other thing about managed metadata, just because I don't know where people are coming from. The other thing about managed metadata that it allowed you to do that you couldn't do in SharePoint is hierarchy. You can't have one field dependent upon another field. And I already sort of mentioned earlier, you can't have row level security. You can't have row level security in a generic sense based on a field driver. You can go break security and have it, and just don't ever do it because it performs very poorly.
Very important.
But yeah, so I think that the ability to have hierarchy, the ability, if instead of calling it Big Blue, you now call it Big Green because it got a coat of paint, that changes everywhere, right? Like you can make that change, and after a couple of hours, that'll go everywhere. It drives records managers a little bit batty because it changes their records, but
Which are supposed to be immutable, but never mind all
right,
that.
right. It's just supposed to be immutable, right? It still means the same
Yeah,
thing.
mere suggestion.
Yeah. But yeah, so I think there are lots of issues with it. And I think one of the other things we sort of skipped over as we're talking about metadata is multi-select metadata and lookup fields also have some interesting characteristics to them, I'll call them, because multi-selects aren't implemented as you would in a relational database where there is this field and it's tied to a parent and you can have 5 rows and that's the 3, it's the 5 options that you've got. They stack them into one field with delimiters, which makes sorting hard, and it's one of the reasons why the view interface is a little weird. Lookups have the same issue where you are what you see is not what's actually stored. And so it makes developing with them sometimes difficult, particularly with like a REST interface, because you get back the raw and you're like, what is this pound semicolon's the thing, right? Like it's the actual delimiter, and you get it back and you're like, what do we do with this? And you're like, you throw it away.
I remember having these conversations with some of the Microsoft folks when the SharePoint framework was first coming out, and they said, "Well, now anybody can develop against SharePoint." I said,
Right.
Yeah, they can, and they'll give up the first time they hit a manage metadata field.
Right.
That'll be the end of that.
Right. The first time they get back the 3 fields that make up the managed metadata field, and they go, which one do I need? And you're like, well, sort of all of them. Depends on what you're doing.
Yeah. Or they try to get a hyperlink and realize you have to merge 3 fields to actually get a hyperlink, right? They're going to give up and walk away.
Right. Well, or URLs are stored with a comma, right?
Of course, because that's how you do it.
Right. Were they watching War Games when they did this? Right? Like, was this Whopper? They're like, ooh, if we put a comma in, they can't launch the missiles.
To that one, I remember having a conversation. This would have been Tech Ed Orlando, like 2006 or 2007. When they first came up with the pods, we went and talked to everybody at the pods, and I was talking to somebody on the team. I won't name names. And we're talking about that specific thing about the URL commas. And I said, apparently you've never worked with web content management systems that store URLs that have 1,000 commas. Yeah. I forget what the popular one was at the time, but all of its complex URLs all had a bunch of commas in them.
Yeah. It was interesting. The product has got a lot of really great things about it. I think we've all learned some of the quirks, and even in the REST interface, right? So do a little bit on the dev side. Even today, SharePoint lists, though you can relate them through lookups, they don't behave in any way like a relational database. You can't say, give me all of X where Y, where X and Y are in 2 different lists. You can't do that. It doesn't know how to do that. But every tool's got legacy.
If you want to overload the back end, you could do a nice join in a REST call with OData and watch it completely blow up.
It just goes.
You can see the steam coming from the data center.
Absolutely.
So where do we go from here? What does the future of ECM look like in the Microsoft space? If we don't solve the Teams problem, do we even have a future?
Well, I think we're going to continue to do what we're doing, right? I think labels you called out, that's the way of the future. I think metadata is going to take a back seat. I think the decision has been made that in the user interface area where we're interacting with users, when we're doing collaboration, those sorts of things, those are not going to have metadata first and foremost. They have them, right? Like, so now you can do columns and their shared views and whatever, but it's still not the same. Again, I think we lost that battle. And by the way, it's not just Microsoft, it's not just SharePoint that lost the battle of metadata. Everybody's lost in the collaboration side, they've lost it. If it isn't connected to a business process and you don't have a back-end system more or less driving that metadata, for the most part, people don't use it. But future-wise, I see we're going to continue to get more and more files. The OneDrive sync is good, not great. But I'll say that none of the other sync tools are particularly great either when you start to get up into hundreds of thousands of files. They just don't know how to deal with that. So I think that'll continue to get better. And I think from a societal point of view, we've started to expect we can have our file on any device at any time. We're always cloud connected. It's always synchronized to the cloud, blah, 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 blah. And I think that's going to get better, right? Like, I think we'll have, I work on multiple machines and I don't worry about where I put my files. I put them in SharePoint /Teams /OneDrive, whatever. And they're just there. And I think the people like you and I who thought about where files are when we started are going to become rarer and rarer. I think people are just going to say, well, it's in the cloud. It doesn't matter. What about you? What do you think?
Well, I think it's a challenge for organizations that are going to start seeking um, more and better tools. And if we don't have them inside of the Microsoft sphere, I think that could be one of the driving factors that are one of the high risk factors for flight from the platform for larger customers, or at least reduce utilization as they implement other tools. You can't solve this problem with third party components. It has to
Right.
be native. And
Right.
if they can't do it natively, big organizations are going to take their stuff out. And the risk I think we run is that they're going to bring them back down on prem because they have no way to do it effectively in the cloud. And they're
Yep.
not going to bifurcate that content. It's going to be wherever that content is best structured, that's where it's going to live. And we're talking about billions, if not trillions of documents, right, that need to be
Right.
managed that way. It's one of the reasons we've always struggled adopting, law firms and doctors and hospital chains and whatnot is because all of their, not all, but a huge amount of their very important content, right, has to be structurally managed.
Right.
And without a good solution for that, I think that we're leaving a lot of customers in the lurch and is opening up the opportunity for somebody to do that. I think that AI will play a big part in that, right? That we will get better at how we can classify documents based on AI engines. But it's going to have to be done somehow. I don't think there's any way we get away from it.
Right. I think, yeah. I think, and this I think is a great segue to tee us up for what I think will be episode 2 is, I think we get back to content services, and when the users stop caring where the content is, then the organization can dictate where the content is, but it relies on one very important thing. It relies on a solid search platform, which Microsoft has. And that's where I think if we're going to see a place that we can kind of have the one ring to rule them all, right? It's going to be search. If you get search right and you can reach across repositories and get all the data and index it, then users can stay in the tools they love. They issue a search, it gives them the document they want. They don't care whether it's in some back-end system or not. Like, that's not their problem. They just want it.
Mm. So that will, in fact, be episode 2, where we talk more about search and specifically on these topics. That's all the time we have for this episode of Winging It. Rob, any final thoughts?
No, I'm excited for our next conversation. I want everybody to join us.
So once again, be looking for these episodes to be released on a monthly basis, probably a week or two before or after the regular Community Cloudcast content. They will also be syndicated out to all of our podcast channels. For those who aren't aware, we're on, 6 or 7 different podcast platforms, from Spotify to Apple to Google and Amazon and all the ones in between. So all the popular places you like to consume
Zoomcast
your content. I know you'd love to look at our beautiful faces on YouTube, but if you would rather listen to us in the car or while you're working out or whatever it is that you're doing, you can get that from our podcast episodes, which will be available within 24 hours or so of the videos going live. So watch our YouTube channel for that, as well as Facebook, where these will be posted. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us this month. Rob, thank you, sir, as always, and we will see you all next month.
Thanks, brother.